Today, I have a story for you. Back when I was a teenager, I caught car fever, just like so many young boys, just like so many young, warm blooded Americans do when they get their driver's license. I was obsessed looking for cars. I scoured the internet for something that was going to be affordable and fun to drive. I had a budget. I had a max of $5,000, not because I had $5,000 saved up by the time I was 16, but because my father was going to float me a car until I could pay him back for it. This was an interesting deal, and it was one that I was very blessed to have. The idea was he would get me the car so I could go to work, so I could start earning money. Then, if it were a car that I enjoyed, I could buy it from him. If I bought a car that I did not enjoy, I could sell it for him as long as I could sell it for the same amount that he paid for it, and he could recoup the cost, and I could try to find another one. This ended up being very valuable to me as I made a capital mistake when it came to used car shopping, especially in the budget range that I had. I ended up buying my first car sight unseen. The first car that I bought was an Acura TL. The Acura TL was from the year 2000. It was gold, and I bought it off of eBay. I won the auction for around $4,000. I was stoked. This Acura was fully loaded. It had GPS navigation. It had leather seats. It was going to be perfect. What a wonderful car to have for getting going with my first job and going to college. What I didn't know is that the pictures on the listing on eBay excluded a whole bunch of cosmetic damage, and the seller did not disclose that there were major rust issues on the suspension system and the leather seats had been torn. On the suspension system, the mechanic that I asked to look at it showed me that the suspension had rusted out to the point it was flakier than a pie crust. Lastly, the car had a transmission issue that was very common with this particular make and model. Had I done the research appropriately, I would have known that these transmissions fail right around 120,000 miles. The car that I bought was right at 118,000 miles. So I ended up having to sell this thing in short order right before I started school. I sold it to a mechanic who flew out and drove it home, knowing full well what they're getting into, knowing it was a project car and they're planning on trying to flip it for a profit. The next car I bought was off of Copart.com. It was an auction site that takes vehicles that have been repossessed or totaled by insurance and then get auctioned off in order to recoup some of the cost for the insurance company that totaled it. I ended up looking at this website because cars sell for half of their Kelley Blue Book value. Half. I started getting excited trying to find a vehicle that had been totaled due to cosmetic damage, as it didn't bother me as much if I could get something that was newer and more reliable, but was going to be like double the car that I could otherwise afford. I still had the same deal, $5,000 budget with my father. I ended up winning a 2002 Volkswagen Passat. This Passat was white exterior and cream interior. The interior had a bunch of plastic components that were broken off. Didn't seem to bother me. I wanted a deal. I got this car for $3,200. I was stoked. What I didn't do was learn from the first mistake that I had made with the Passat. I bought this thing sight unseen from Oklahoma. When the company that I hired arrived at the auction site to pick up the car and drive it out to me, the auction site brought the vehicle out on a forklift. That was major red flag number 1. After it arrived, I started it up, and it started. Thank goodness. I drove it to a mechanic to get the oil changed, and that mechanic came back to me with some bad news. Jay, we couldn't change the oil on the car because there wasn't any oil to take out of it, but we did fill it up. This was major red flag number 2. This car ended up having so many leaks and so many problems. I was taking it to the local mechanic in Manhattan, Kansas, once every other month. This vehicle had so many problems with it. The mechanic that I took it to, his name was Dave, he came out of the shop one day, about a year of me driving this car, and he said, Jay, we enjoy you coming here to the shop. We've enjoyed getting to know you, and we appreciate your business, but your battery needs a new car. I was really getting tired of having to pay for this thing to get fixed over and over and jumping it about once or twice a week throughout the winter. I didn't know exactly what to do. I didn't have the money to replace the car yet. This one I did buy from my dad, so I owned it outright. I ended up pulling the dipstick one day just to check the level of the oil, and I noticed some white frothiness on there. The white frothiness indicated that there was moisture, condensation that was building it up inside the engine block. When condensation builds up inside your engine block, you end up getting oil sludge that can tear up your engine. This is a death sentence to your car. At least it was in my circumstance. I ended up looking up this car on carcomplaints.com, a website I wish I would have known before I bought the first two cars. Carcomplaints.com has a list of all the used vehicles under the sun, all of the common problems that pop up with them, based on actual drivers' reported problems with the car, thus carcomplaints.com. While they don't sponsor me, I love their website and highly recommend that anybody who's searching for a good used car consult websites like carcomplaints.com to see what major problems their car might have and whether or not it's reliable. They rank cars from avoid like the plague all the way up to a good buy. The Passat that I bought was marked avoid like the plague due to oil sludge issues. I ended up selling that car and needing to get something else in between academic years. I drove to Kansas City with my dad, finally learning buy the car after inspecting it in person. Don't buy the car sight unseen. I couldn't believe it took me this long to figure it out, but I was going to do it right, and my dad tagged along so he could give me his 2 cents and make sure I didn't buy another lemon, because, I was 0 for 2. I had a nice list of cars that I had researched that I thought would be good and reliable. The first one that I found was a Mini Cooper at this itty-bitty tiny dealership. I took it out for a test drive, pulled around the corner, put the pedal to the metal, nothing happened. With nothing happening, I just took it around the block, parked it, popped the hood, noticed that the whole thing had PVC components that were glued together and attached to the engine block. I didn't need this. This was going to be another problem. I needed something better. The next cars I looked at, pulled the dipstick and found metal shavings in them. That engine was already being torn up. I went through the whole list of cars, couldn't find a single one that passed my inspection. On the very end of the trip, on the way back home, my dad found a dealership. They had this vehicle there, an Infiniti G35 from 2004. This car was stellar looking on the outside, cosmetically beautiful, drove really well, passed all my inspections. They ended up offering me double private sale KBB for my trade-in with that Volkswagen Passat. I couldn't pass that up. I was going to make money on a handshake if I could. I ended up buying the car. It was about $5,000 in value and driving it home. And I was so excited to finally have something that was going to be good and reliable. In my research in advance, I didn't look up this car very much specifically, and I really should have walked away until I learned more about it. When I had an internship in Omaha, Nebraska, I was driving this car back late at night and had the brake pads crumble. There were weird vibrations anytime I'd hit the brakes that started getting worse and worse. This model of car had an issue where the brake rotors would warp and bend because they were too thin for the amount of energy that it was dissipating to slow the car down. This meant that the brake pads eventually would vibrate apart. This ended up costing me, I think, $500 to replace, and cost me a very scary moment where I was trying to exit off the highway without brakes. After that, I had the Infiniti G35 when I had an internship in Salt Lake City, Utah. I was driving up to Park City on one of the hottest days of the summer. It was over 100 degrees outside. The car started acting as if it wasn't getting enough power. I was hitting the gas trying to go uphill, and it wasn't giving me anything. Looking at the dials, I was overheating. I hadn't hit the red zone, but it was very clear that the car's coolant system was failing. This wasn't good. Once I made it to the top of the hill, I hit max overheating and the engine started smoking. I pulled aside at this truck stop where another semi-truck had also had the same issue coming uphill. Popped open the hood, and there was coolant everywhere. This thing had cracked open like a coconut. The thermometer had failed, and the water pump that circulates the coolant through the radiator had kicked off because it wasn't reading anything worth kicking on for. And the coolant overheated, expanded, and ripped the radiator apart. Ended up paying a nearby gas station mechanic to replace it with an aftermarket part. The OEM part was going to be somewhere like $3,000 to $4,000, and the car wasn't quite worth that much anymore at that point. The point of the story is there are a lot of things, especially with cars, that we need to know about before we put a huge investment into the car. It's not that used cars are unreliable. There are a lot of very reliable used cars. I'm happy to say that I own 2 incredibly reliable used cars now that haven't given me near any trouble. The knowledge that we can acquire before making a major decision like this so that we can make a decision that is as wise as possible is an exercise in prudence. And that is what we're going to be covering today in our main topic. We're going to continue talking about frugality, and in particular,